Today. I have known our speaker for about 17 years. Uh, when he was one of my professors and mentors in graduate school. He has since moved on to sunnier and warmer locations. He's a professor in the School of Education at the University of California, Irvine, where he is the director of the Cultural Resiliency and Learning Center. His primary research interests focus on understanding positive social development and health in culturally diverse children and adolescents. He has published over 200 books, chapters, and research papers. He's received funding from various agencies, including NSF and NIH, and serves on several journal editorial boards, including Child Development, which is one of the big ones in developmental psych, and Journal of Early Adolescence, which is also a big one in adolescence. Dr. Carlo has also received several awards for his research and mentorship. He's still a mentor of mine, even though we joke around the way we do. He currently serves as a member of the SRCD, which is the Society for Research on Child Development Governing Council. He's an associate editor at the International Journal of Behavioral and Development, and he's a co-editor of the upcoming APA Handbook of Adolescent Development. Today, he will present his research on prosocial behaviors among Latinx families. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Gustavo Carlo.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. I truly appreciate it. I have to say, she probably knows this, but my greatest accomplishment is not all those publications, not any of those grants, not any of those other awards, but it was putting up with Maria for all those years during graduate school and even after graduate school. I consider that my greatest accomplishment. I think it's going to be on my epitaph when I pass away. It'll probably be on my tombstone. But I am so proud of Maria and all that she has accomplished. I can't say enough great things about Maria. And so it is really an honor and a pleasure to be invited to speak to her colleagues and to her students and to all of you here at or there at Humboldt University. I do a lot of work in a lot of different areas. I mean, if you dare glance at my vita, you would probably be freaked out a little bit by some of the things that I work on, some of the projects that I work on, which seem far afield from my core area. My core area of interest is prosocial and moral development in children and adolescents. And I study all of the possible correlates associated with prosocial and moral development. And it turns out that there are a lot of correlates. There are a lot of things that predict prosocial moral development in children and adolescents. And there's a lot of things that prosocial behaviors, which are positive social behaviors like sharing and being kind to others and caring for others, those behaviors are also associated with a lot of other developmental consequences for children and adolescents. All of my work centers around this theme of prosocial and moral development. And my other theme, which is studying these positive developmental processes and behaviors in culturally diverse populations and groups. And within the US, the group that I have focused most of my work has been on Latinx families and children and youth. But I also do some international work. So today I wanted to really focus on this sort of more focused area of research, which is understanding prosocial development in Latinx youth and thinking about prosocial development in Latinx youth from a sort of cultural resiliency framework, from a framework of thinking about prosocial development not only as a desirable outcome that I think most of us would agree our parents and ourselves as parents would want our kids to turn out to be prosocial and be nice to other people and respectful and all those good things, all those goody things. But it's also a a process that can actually reap all kinds of benefits, personal benefits for the individual, as well as for society. So let me now, I imagine I've got the share screen power. I've been given the power. So I'm going to, please let me know if you can see that.
Yeah, it looks good on our end.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, at least I got that for you. As you can see, the title of my talk today is Fostering Latina Kids to be Bien Educados. And I will explain a little bit what I mean by bien educado. But at this point, I would say that the notion of bien educado is something that is strongly encouraged and taught in many Latina families, Latina families within the U.S. as well as Latina families outside the U.S. Within the U.S., Latinos and Latinas face a number of challenges, and many of these challenges are pretty well documented. But scholars refer to many of these adverse conditions as health disparities and academic disparities, and so we are at risk for living in poverty. We're at risk for sort of underperforming in terms of educational achievement and attainment. We're at risk for incarceration. We're at risk for lack of health insurance and healthcare, access to healthcare. We're at risk for disproportionate levels of infant mortality rates. Excuse me. We're also at risk for physical as well as psychological health issues and problems. And of course, all of these factors, all of these risk statistics are multi-dimensional. They're incredibly complex. There's all kinds of very sophisticated and difficult and challenging reasons for why US Latino and Latinas face a number of these kinds of risk factors. But underlying many of these risk factors are not just poverty, which in and of itself is something that places ethnic and racial minority populations at greater risk for other negative outcomes, but obviously also there's racism, discrimination, and prejudice. But in the face of all these adversities and problems, the one thing that is also true about Latinos and Latinas is the incredible capacity for kindness, for goodness, for caring for others, for responding to the needs of others. And there are many examples of this, and obviously some examples that are more extreme examples, and in times of natural disasters or tragedies, or even family tragedies. But there's also the day-to-day sort of caring and kindness that we also can observe in many, if not all, Latina families and communities. And my work really comes from this assumption, from this sort of basic belief that being prosocial, being someone who is caring for others and kind towards others and generous towards, that these are not things that just happen by, by chance, but that in fact, it's the culmination of a variety of experiences that are inherent in our culture. They're inherent in traditional Latino, Latina cultural values and beliefs and behaviors and practices. And therefore, they're taught to our children, they're encouraged, they are reinforced, and they make up an intrinsic part of our culture and what it means to be a Latino or Latina or a Latinx person of Latinx heritage. So let's get in a little bit more into what it means to be prosocial. So prosocial behaviors are actions that benefit others. And again, these are acts of kindness, sharing, helping others, comforting, volunteering. There's a number of actions that fall under this broad category. The basic idea is that these actions benefit other people. They have beneficial consequences to others. And it's often contrasted to aggressive behaviors and aggressive actions, which have harmful or injurious consequences towards others. Under this broad rubric of prosocial behaviors, there are subtypes of prosocial behaviors. And one of the most interesting ones, and one of the most debated ones, one that Maria loves to debate with me all the time, is the subset of actions that have been termed altruistic behaviors. And altruistic behaviors have been defined in many different ways, but for our purposes and for the work that we do, we define altruistic behaviors as actions that are primarily intended to benefit others. And so the idea here is not that there's ever any purely altruistic behaviors that exist, but that in fact, we sometimes engage in prosocial behaviors primarily to benefit other people with sort of less consideration of the consequences to our own selves. And now, if you think about what are some of these kinds of actions that we might term or label as altruistic, then once again, we can come up with a range of actions and behaviors, some that are quite extreme, individuals who risk their own lives, their own personal lives, right, to rescue someone, to help someone else. If we think about the 9/11 World Trade Center, we think about all those individuals who risked their own lives to go into the burning buildings and to try to rescue and save other individuals. And yes, I know some of them got paid as firefighters or police officers or whatever, but nobody will ever convince me that firefighters get paid enough money to risk their own lives to rescue the lives of others. And that's true of many other healthcare professionals. We think about the COVID pandemic and the fact that many workers are out there literally risking their own personal safety and lives, or the lives of their own family members by going out there and really trying to help and care for people who are ill and who are suffering from the COVID virus. There are other actions that are heroic in nature, a soldier that might throw themselves on a grenade in order to save the lives of his or her comrades. Well, anyway, I'm sure we all can think of these kinds of examples. But I do want to also point out that once again, we don't always have to think about very extreme circumstances where our own lives or the life of someone is at risk. Altruistic actions can also be day-to-day activities. It could refer to someone who voluntarily, who is a volunteer every day for a charitable organization, and they're committed to it over the long long-term, and they might volunteer at a local food bank or something like that, or maybe they're a caregiver who is, obviously the cost is time, the cost might be money, the cost might be, mental energy, but there are circumstances where there are individuals that are actually doing quite altruistic behaviors, and they're really getting little or nothing in return, and they certainly don't expect to get something in return for those actions. And my point is that these altruistic behaviors are not just the historical extreme examples that we often think about, like an Oscar Schindler who, risked his own life, even though he was a wealthy German businessman, and he tried to rescue Jews from the ghetto, from the Jewish ghetto, from execution by Nazis. And the last thing I would say is that because there are different types of prosocial behaviors, and some of these behaviors are different because they may be motivated by either altruism or the opposite of it, which is the fact that sometimes people engage in prosocial behaviors for selfish reasons. So someone might do something nice to someone, and really they're doing it because they're trying to gain their trust so that they can take advantage of them later on. So again, keep in mind that it's important to understand what is the underlying motive behind the behaviors, as well as what are the characteristics of these different kinds of behaviors. So it's not a simple sort of unidimensional construct, it's a multidimensional construct. So why should we care about prosocial behaviors and studying prosocial behaviors? Well, as I already alluded to, first off, we already know that people who are prosocial, who tend to be prosocial, not necessarily even altruistic, but just prosocial in general, they actually tend to demonstrate better physical health, better psychological health, and better well-being. And again, I don't have enough time to go into what are all the reasons for all of this, but part of it is because it turns out that when we engage in prosocial behaviors, our brain releases good hormones, good neurotransmitters, such as oxytocin and serotonin and dopamine, which actually strengthen our immune system. So in one classic study, I'll just give you one little study because I don't want to tease you. In one classic study conducted of nuns over 30 years, researchers went in and coded the diaries of these nuns, and they found that nuns who engaged in more charitable activities, and yes, not all nuns engage in the same levels of charitable activities. Those that engaged in more charitable activities actually, on average, lived 12 years longer than the nuns who engaged in less charitable activities. So pretty impressive kind of stuff. There is a lot of other much more rigorous research on this topic, but we don't have time to get into it. Also, very recently, one of my graduate students just published a meta-analysis review and demonstrated that across many, many different studies, there was a negative relation between prosocial behaviors and depressive symptoms. And again, part of that is probably because, as we know, when you do something good for someone else, it helps to make you feel better. So if you're ever down or something, do something nice for someone. There's nothing wrong with that. Another important reason why we should care about prosocial behaviors is because, again, parents care about it. If you ask parents what are the most desirable qualities and characteristics that they would like their kids to demonstrate and to show, I would bet you a modest amount of money, not too much because I don't want to risk it that much, but I would pretty much bet you that being prosocial characteristics would be near the top or at the top of that list. Also, of course, communities care. We're living in a society right now that's very divided, and we ought to care about how we can foster or promote these positive social behaviors, especially between different groups, between intergroup harmony and cooperation, which we dearly, dearly, desperately need right now in our society. And not just within our society, but of course across societies too. So we want to address some of these global challenges of famine and the pandemic and immigration, war, all of those sorts of things. It requires prosocial behaviors on the part of humans. So it benefits our society. In fact, from the perspective of immigrant Latina families, prosocial behaviors are integral to foster the ability of these immigrant populations to actually socially integrate into our society. And that requires prosocial behaviors on both sides, so to speak, of the aisle, right? It requires us to be able to be willing to reach out and help people who come from different groups, ethnic, racial groups, as well as it requires the majority society persons to reach out to the new immigrant groups and help them integrate into our society. And if all of that still doesn't convince you that this is an important topic, I could throw some numbers at you. Maybe money matters. It turns out that there have been many, many studies, and this is just one example, but volunteerism contributes approximately $36.5 billion to our economy. And that is based on what those volunteers would be paid if in fact they were paid employees. So volunteerism, which is only one form of prosocial behavior, is incredibly important, even at the level on an economic scale to our country. Okay. So how do we get there? Well, if you glance at the literature, and if you're bored this Friday and you want a great pizza party with your friends, invite them to read, this book, for example, on prosocial development, and you can learn all about all the different factors that are associated with prosocial behaviors and prosocial development. So we can start with the biological basis for these behaviors. As you can imagine, even from an evolutionary perspective, it's incredibly important that humans have the capacity for altruistic and prosocial behaviors. I mean, perhaps one of the most altruistic behaviors that we can think of is the caregiver's love for their child when they're born, and how they care for their child. And as we all know, it's quite a bit of a sacrifice to have a child and to care for them and to love them and to want to raise them to be healthy and happy. So there are evolutionary reasons for why prosocial behaviors, we have the capacity for prosocial behaviors. There are built-in mechanisms, biological mechanisms, the genetics, it's a heritable trait, characteristic, but also there's the mechanisms, the neurotransmitters that are built in to actually help to sort of reinforce these prosocial behaviors and actions. Temperament is definitely also associated with it. I mean, kids who are prosocial tend to be well regulated, so they regulate their emotions very well. They don't get overly aroused or under aroused. They actually are moderately aroused. They care. They're aroused enough to care for someone, but they're not over aroused that it it becomes aversive and it makes them flee the situation or freeze in the situation. And that's all related to one's temperament. There are other factors like empathy and sympathy, feeling sorrow for other people. And these are things that are also taught, but also have a biological basis to it. There's moral reasoning, so the ability to think about moral dilemma situations and to invoke principles and values, moral values, prosocial values, the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, any of those sorts of things. We'll talk more about values a little later on, but those are all associated with prosocial behaviors. There are also contextual characteristics. There's SES characteristics. There's different characteristics of the community, including the school climate, neighborhood safety and risk and those kinds of things. And then finally, there's a number of socialization agents and socialization forces, including parents and other family members, peers, the media, and other significant adults, such as teachers. And I'm going to focus most of the remaining time of my talk on family and parents and their influence on Latinx children and adolescents' development. And this is where I want to come back to, loop back to this idea of how many Latinx kids and adolescents are taught to be bien educado. So the phrase bien educado, the literal translation is well educated, but it's not, the meaning is very different. It's not referring to formal education. It's actually referring to the concept that our children should be well-mannered, that they should have good moral character, they should be cultured individuals, treat others with respect, and so on and so forth. So you can see that the cultural definition, meaning of the phrase bien educado really is inherently prosocial. And I know that there are other ethnic groups where they have similar notions to this notion of bien educado, but the notion of bien educado is the one that seems to apply to Latinx families. So this is something that is taught. This is something that is passed from caregivers to their offspring, from one generation to the next. And in the traditional parenting literature in developmental psychology, most of the focus in the prior work has been on how parents, the styles that parents use in raising their children. And there are sort of two major dimensions to this. There's the support dimension, which is warmth or nurturance, how loving, how affectionate, how supportive are parents. And then the other one, which is control, how controlling are the parents? And that has to do with things like behavioral control or psychological control, efforts to really try to modulate a child's behavior. The perfect example of that is how we discipline our children. And in this literature, the gold standard by most researchers has been what's deemed or what's been called the authoritative parenting style, which is characterized by a parent who is high on support, but moderate on control. And the combination of that is deemed to be most beneficial for children. However, there are some major limitations, serious limitations to the study of parenting from this sort of approach, from this, and again, not enough time to go into too deeply on these things, but one example of a limitation is the idea of what do we consider to be high enough support and what do we consider to be moderate control. And that can differ across different contexts, across different individuals, across different cultures. And that makes it very, very difficult to implement, for example, parenting intervention programs, parenting education programs, or programs to try and teach parents to be authoritative. It's quite challenging. So we need to go beyond that. So one of the things that we've done is we've tried to identify other things that parents do and actually get down and dirty a little bit into, rather than talking about styles, to actually talk about techniques and practices and strategies that parents might use. And we call this the parenting practices approach. It starts with understanding what are the sort of perhaps quote unquote best ways of disciplining children. And in the literature, we know already that there's good evidence that when you use reasoning, when you try to induce what's called role taking in your child, whenever they do something bad, you try to get them to think about what they've done from the perspective of the victim, from other people's perspectives, so that they understand that the consequences of their actions were consequences that they themselves probably would not want for themselves. I don't know if I said that right, but I think so. We'll just move on and act like I did. All right. That is all good and done and everything. And clearly we do need to understand, what are best practices to use when disciplining our children. But one of the limitations of just focusing on disciplining practices is that now we're only talking about situations when a kid does something wrong, something bad. And of course, we'd like to believe that most of the time our kids are not engaging in bad behaviors. So these transgressive contexts are really kind of limited in frequency. And so the question is, what are they learning when they're not being bad? Because we would argue that, of course, they are also learning about morals. They're also learning about prosociality in other contexts other than when they do something bad. And in fact, we've been sort of increasing some of our attention and some of our work to some of these other practices. And so these are things that probably most of you can identify with, but parents, when our kids do something good, they actually try to reward them. And there are two general forms of rewards. One is social reward, where you just praise them, or you give them a hug, or you say, what a good job, or whatever. And then there are material rewards, where you actually, buy them a treat, or you give them money, or you give them some sort of concrete reward for their good behavior. Parents also engage in moral conversations about morals. Sometimes that might be when they're reading a book to them, or maybe they watch a movie and they talk about them, or maybe the kid comes home from school and tells the parent about something that happened at school, and the parents might take that brief window of opportunity to teach them a little lesson, or encourage a value or a certain behavior. And then another way that parents can teach kids to be moral and prosocial is by actually giving them hands-on experience, either in the home by assigning chores and responsibilities, or in the community, right, by having them volunteer maybe for their church or something like that. So there are many different ways, and we have found that that those practices do matter. Okay, so based on that sort of background work that's been done with many different ethnic racial groups, we now can shift our attention and hone in a little more on US Latinx youth. In terms of socialization, there are two major mechanisms by which Latinx youth and children are socialized. One is acculturation, which is how they learn about their new culture. And the source of the majority of that learning stems from hanging out with their peers, from media, social media, TV, movies, internet, and of course, other majority culture adults like teachers and whatnot. But the other process that is also occurring simultaneously for Latinx youth is what's termed enculturation. And so many of these youth are also at the same time learning about their own ethnic heritage. And the parents oftentimes, or family members oftentimes, are trying to encourage them to retain that ethnic heritage identity. And there are certain family ethnic socialization practices that they engage in that sort of are meant and designed to sort of teach them about their ethnic heritage. So encouraging their kids to attend, to have dinner with their family, to attend events that are Spanish language events, movies or concerts or whatever, or, you know, encouraging, requiring perhaps their kids to go, you know, to a grandparents' birthday parties instead of hanging out with their friends, or going to a quinceanera or some culture group-related event. And all of these things are meant to foster ethnic pride. They also teach kids about the importance of the family, familismo, which we'll talk about later, a little bit later on. And they teach them other cultural values like respeto or respect, respect for elders, respect for authority, and so on. So I'm going to focus on a couple of these sort of mechanisms that have been well researched in Latinx families and youth. The first one is familismo, which is familism. And familismo really is also a multidimensional construct. It's not just understanding or acquiring this connection to and duty and obligation to the family, but it's also sort of involves the kids' own self-concept of who they are. And so the referent part of it is the notion that they are part of the family group, and therefore their behaviors have repercussions and consequences for the family. It's not just individual consequences. And of course, the family is very important in terms of a source of support, but also it's the target of support from the kids themselves. The other major process is ethnic identity and bicultural identity. And that has to do with this integration of an affinity to your own ethnic heritage. And bicultural identity is referring to those individuals who adopt not only ethnic identity, affinity to their own ethnic heritage, but they might also adopt some aspects of the majority culture. And so they navigate between the two. And in the literature, both of these constructs have been linked in Latinx youth, have been linked to better educational outcomes, improved mental health outcomes, and reduced problem behaviors. I think I'm running out of time, so I want to be mindful of that. Is that right? Someone tell me, Aaron, am I?
Typically, we do leave about 10 minutes for questions, but if you
Okay.
keep going until you're finished with your presentation.
Okay, so I'm just going to rush through some of this stuff, but basically, these are all other sorts of cultural values and strengths that I think are inherent in Latinx families and culture. And some of these I've already mentioned, the respeto and the bien educado, But the bottom line is that many of these cultural, ingrained cultural beliefs and values are also linked to prosociality. So what does the research tell us on prosocial development in Latinx youth? Well, as you might expect, it turns out that many of these traditional Latina values actually also predict altruistic and prosocial behaviors. So again, not all Latinx youth endorse these values to the same degree, right? Some of them endorse them more strongly, some of them don't endorse them at all, or they endorse them weakly. Those that endorse these values more strongly tend to be more prosocial. So it actually does seem to work as a mechanism for fostering and promoting prosocial behaviors in Latinx youth. It turns out that, just as a contrast, in Latinx youth who actually endorse materialism and personal achievement values, that actually undermines altruistic behaviors, but it does foster selfishly motivated prosocial behaviors. So those are individuals that will engage in prosocial behaviors, but only if it really results in benefits to themselves. And they seem to be more motivated by that than by benefiting others. In a couple of studies, at least, we've demonstrated that these values actually are transmitted by Latinx parents. And just to give you a simple sort of overview of some of the work, for example, in one study, we showed that mothers, Latinx mothers, Latina mothers who strongly endorse familism values, they were more likely to use parenting practices to foster familism. So they would assign chores and they were more likely to assign chores and responsibilities to their kids, taking care of their younger siblings and so on and so on. And those mothers who did that, who used those practices, the kids would pick up on those parenting practices. And they, in turn, would strongly adopt and endorse familism values. And ultimately, all of that predicted higher levels of prosocial behaviors in these Latinx youth. So you can see here the full model of how these values are transmitted from caregivers to their children, to Latinx children, and ultimately how those values guide children's behaviors. It turns out that we have also evidence that shows that a very similar evidence that parents, Latinx parents, actually also foster stronger ethnic identity in Latinx kids, and those kids that endorse a stronger ethnic identity are also more prosocial. I don't have time to get into that, so I'm going to go right to conclusions here. In essence, our evidence, our research is demonstrating that there are in fact cultural assets and resources and strengths that are inherent in Latinx culture that actually lead to and result in higher levels, more of a tendency for Latinx kids to engage in prosocial behaviors. The parenting practices tend to be ethnic-based, ethnic-focused kinds of parenting practices, because of course they end up teaching their kids about the traditional cultural values, that whole idea of enculturation. And they also tend to foster stronger ethnic identity or bicultural identity in these kids. I want to say one thing about that. What the research demonstrates is that Latinx kids who reject their ethnic identity are the ones that actually demonstrate more negative developmental outcomes and less prosocial behaviors. So it's really the key is the extent to which they adopt or are willing to identify with their ethnic heritage, even if they are biculturally bicultural. These cultural values and ethnic identity enhance their social well-being. We have research that demonstrates that prosocial behaviors are, for example, linked to better educational outcomes in Latinx kids. That was the work that I skipped over, but again, prosocial behaviors in and of themselves turn into a protective factor, a resiliency factor. And in the end, as I mentioned before, if we can find ways and come to understand and support programs and efforts that foster prosocial behaviors in Latinx kids and in our communities, then I think we have better chance of attaining social integration and getting to a point where Latinx kids have a chance for positive well-being and health outcomes. So I think I will, oh no, there was one last thing. I'm gonna run through this. How do we make a bien educado kid? You start with a good dose of traditional Latino values, such as familismo, respeto, strong ethnic identity, and some good moral values. Add a couple of tablespoons of sympathy and moral reasoning to the mix. Mix in a supportive household with minimal family conflict, a healthy amount of parental warmth, some inductive discipline and prosocial parenting practices. Transfer to a nice supportive school environment, inclusive community. Cover, let simmer for a few years. Serve at room temperature, and then you enjoy. Okay. I think I will end right there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carlo. I don't know if you're able to see, but we have a lot of applause in through the emojis in Zoom. So I'm going to assume that the audience also enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor open to any questions that you may have. Again, you can either unmute yourselves and speak, or you can message through the chat, and those of us who are here can speak the question for you if you don't feel comfortable. So does anybody have any questions or comments for Dr. Carlo? Maria, you look poised to strike.
That's such a negative way to frame that.
Dr. Carlo, I actually have a question, and this is also based off of the article that I presented this morning on your research. And so I apologize if I'm confusing the two. In the article that I presented this morning, it stated that sympathy and empathy were, I guess, motivations for moral or for prosocial behavior in a kind of acute situation, and that oh, you just said it. Oh no, I lost it. But that doesn't stand for long-term situations. Under long-term situations, you have moral reasoning is kind of the backbone of prosocial behavior. Do those can those mix? Can those two situations mix, or is this you kind of hinted at the end there, a little bit of sympathy, a little bit of moral reasoning for prosocial behavior? Do we find that in the research that those mix at some point?
Yeah, excellent question. And the short answer is yes. I mean, there's a long running debate in psychology about the role, the primacy of emotions versus cognitions. But really, in the end, like the answers to most puzzles, major puzzles like nature versus nurture, it's both. And there is some really good research that has been done that demonstrates that that sympathy can actually induce or evoke specific moral principles or moral values and moral reasoning, and vice versa. That, you know, engaging in thinking about a moral dilemma could actually also induce sympathy, right? So the more you think about the situation of someone, a moral situation of someone, that might actually eventually manifest itself into feeling sorry for that person, right? Or feeling sad for that person. So those two processes, although they're measured separately, they have somewhat different traditions, theoretical traditions, and certainly the methodologies are, in terms of measuring each of those constructs, are quite distinct, even though we sort of separate them. Oftentimes, in the end, they're actually intertwined, and often intertwined. And I mean, that speaks to our basic human nature, that, you know, I mean, that little thing that we have up here in our head is, you know, all those neurons are connected to one another. And so we often, you know, make we have affective associations with everything that we engage in, and you know, behaviors and with thoughts, right? And that's why, you know, when you hear a powerful speech by someone, or you listen to great music by, you know, Ozuna or Bad Bunny or whatever, you know, that evokes emotions, right? Even though, and the lyrics themselves oftentimes evoke certain emotions. It's the same thing with moral development. So yeah, those two things are intertwined, and that's what makes us really difficult to understand. That's what makes human behavior so difficult to understand.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Carlo, I have a quick question for you. So I think Maria and I have had a couple conversations about like reinforcement of behavior and things like that. So I was thinking about how we've kind of incentivized prosocial behavior, particularly in like schools through like positive behavior intervention systems and things like that. And I'm wondering about your thoughts of if this is kind of like driving more selfish prosocial behavior rather than selfless prosocial behavior.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have always believed and in the notion that our educational system is not a system or structure that fosters and rewards prosocial behaviors. It's quite the contrary. It's, you know, but it reflects the collectivist orientation of our society. It reflects those values that I briefly mentioned, the materialism and the personal achievement, personal wealth. And so the only forms of prosocial behaviors that are encouraged by those kinds of values, are selfishly motivated prosocial behaviors, egoistically motivated. So unfortunately, that results in, you know, individuals who might engage in an action that benefits someone else, but it usually has an instrumental purpose to it. It might be because they're, you know, they're networking with that person so that, you know, hopefully later on they get, you know, a job, or they get some favor in return, you know, reciprocal. There's this idea that evolutionary scholars talk about, which is reciprocal altruism. And it's unfortunate that they use the term altruism, because by definition, reciprocal altruism is not altruistic. It's behavior that you engage in expecting to get reciprocated, right? To get that in return. And but it is definitely an adaptive form of prosocial behavior, and so it's prevalent, and it's particularly prevalent in our society, in the U.S. and within the educational system. You know, there are alternative educational programs, and some people have done some really great work demonstrating that those programs are fantastic at teaching, you know, children learn a lot from those more prosocial, cooperative, care-oriented programs. And the bonus, you also get kids who are actually more prosocial, you know, and less selfishly motivated and less aggressive, less hostile, less competitive, you know. Maria knows this early work that one of my mentors, George Knight, engaged in, that demonstrated consistently across childhood and adolescence that Mexican heritage kids and Latina heritage kids engage in higher levels of cooperative behaviors and lower levels of competitive behaviors than white European American kids. And that's, I mean, that's old news. But, you know, and, but I think, you know, there again, a lot of that stems from our culture, from Latinx culture. And some of it is out of necessity because many Latin American countries are ag-based economies. And so a lot of kids from Latin America and parents grew up in these agricultural communities where it was really important for them to cooperate with one another and to get along with one another and to help each other out, right? But there again, those are beliefs and those are values, those are behaviors that are passed from one generation to the next. And then that does create some challenges for immigrant kids, because if they come from this, if our families come from these Latin American countries where the orientation is collectivism rather than individualism, and they're thrust and thrown into this educational system, which is individualistically oriented, then you can imagine all the challenges that that creates. Stress and, you know, difficulties in sort of succeeding by the standards that are placed on them by our educational system. So it does create major challenges and problems. And yeah, I mean, I really believe that if we wanted to really, the best starting point for changing the orientation of most kids in our society would be to start with our educational system.
Well, there's also the work of Barbara Rogoff, where she talks about chores and how parents themselves socialize this prosocial aspect right out of their kids. Where, you know, initially kids are very cooperative with each other, but as they progress, parents themselves, like, you're not doing this right. You need to do it this way. You need to be the best at this. That we ourselves as parents start removing that aspect that in many kids is already inherent. And she has a lot of work. She does a lot of cross-cultural work where she shows that in other countries where that isn't being socialized out, that those kids continue to maintain those behaviors.
That's right.
But unfortunately, in the U.S., because of the mentality that we're pushing about the individualism, those kids may start off, like, you'll notice, I don't know how many people have noticed this, that kids really want to help clean the house, right? But as they get older, they're like, I don't want to do this anymore. And part of that is because we start telling them, you're not doing this the right way. You're not doing it the best way. You're not doing this, the other. So they start pulling back more and more so that they stop wanting to be more cooperative. They stop wanting to be helpful because they couldn't do it the way that they were supposed to. So it's something that we as our own society are sort of removing from them.
Look at you, Maria. You sound like a prosocial development scholar. Wow.
Where did I learn that stuff from? Lab had to read prosocial work, so.
Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I mean, developmental scholars talk about person-environment fit, and that's really what we're facing is that there's a misfit, so to speak, between these our cultural values and our beliefs and rituals and customs and the new majority society that we're immersed in. So there's two ways of dealing with that, or at least two possible ways. One is we can change our society. We can influence, right? The greater the numbers of Latinos and Latinas and Latinx people in the US, and the more voters, the more registered voters, and all, the more political leaders, and the more we gain economic power in this country, we can gradually at least modify and tweak some of these systems. And you see some of that happening in some school districts in some parts of the country, and you see that happening in business organizations and in some institutions of higher learning. So it's interesting that I just got here to UCI this year, but I'm in the School of Education. I've never been in the School of Education before. I'm a trained developmental psychologist. And it's really interesting to see how I can already envision ways of modifying our education training programs so that we can instill some of these more flexible values and beliefs and be much more accepting of those rather than the tradition that many of you probably know. I mean, California has a history of English language only laws and all kinds of, anti-immigrant, anti-Latino, Latina population laws and policies to, because they're trying to lobotomize those things out of our brains. But we can actually, so that's one possibility. The other thing I would say, though, is that the work on bicultural identity also gives us hope, should give us hope, because as I mentioned before, it's not that we have to wholeheartedly transform ourselves into an individualistic person or oriented person culture, but in fact we could also do okay by learning to navigate both cultural worlds. And so from a parent's perspective, I think that's really important, because it doesn't force Latinx parents to make a decision, okay, am I going to raise my kid to be a Latin, to be proud of their heritage and, and to identify with their ethnicity, or am I going to have to teach them about majority society so that they have a chance to be successful? The bicultural identity work seems to suggest that, in fact, you could do both. You could teach your kid to have a strong affinity to their ethnic heritage, and that doesn't preclude them from being able to also learn what they need to learn and do what they need to do in order to be successful in this majority society. So, I think that's kind of good. As I said, though, the one thing is that is to be careful about is to to try to find ways so that your kid doesn't outright reject their ethnicity and their ethnic heritage, because that seems to present much more difficult challenges for Latinx kids when they reject their ethnic heritage. And that's something that we probably need more research on, is trying to figure out ways so that kids are receptive to learning about their ethnicity and their heritage, so that they can retain that important part of who they are. There's some questions, I think, in the chat.
Yeah, I was actually gonna ask them.
Okay.
Once we got through Doug's question. So I'm gonna ask this in a two-part way, just to make sure I cover what the person's asking. Have there been studies which show that there is a higher prosocial behavior with strong ethnic identity within Latino or Latina children? Is there also research that shows a lower, the opposite or similar effect of prosocial behavior with Caucasian or white children who have a stronger ethnic, or who have a strong identity?
No, I'm not aware of any such research, in part because ethnic identity doesn't tend to be studied in white European American populations. However, I would loop back to that work that I mentioned, briefly alluded to earlier, about the cooperative and competitive behaviors. That has been linked to collectivist values and individualistic values. And so while there hasn't been work specifically looking at ethnic identity in white European American kids, as compared to, or within white European American kids, when you look at white European American kids who endorse collectivist values, they are more prosocial than white European American kids that endorse individualistic values. And that is an important point to make, because I don't want to give the wrong impression that Latinx cultures, uniquely, possess this collectivist orientation, or any, there's a lot of heterogeneity within Latinx families and communities. Some Latinx families are, some of the parents in Latinx families, for example, do believe that the best thing for their kids is to adopt majority society cultures, and they do everything they possibly can to teach their kids about that, and to do less to teach them about their ethnic heritage. But also within white European American society, we probably all know that there are certain subgroups that also tend to strongly endorse collectivism. And so in rural communities, rural families, for example, that tend to be a bit more conservative, and again, ag-based kinds of communities, there is a tendency for a collectivist orientation. In amongst at least some of those some families that reside in those communities. So it's not an either or sort of thing. It's more of a continuum across between culture groups, but even within culture groups, there's variability, and there is that sort of work, but not specifically on ethnic identity.
No, and I would agree with you. It's much more that worldview, because it's that perspective of what the collectivistic and individualistic, but even within collectivistic and individualistic, there are degrees to that itself, vertical or horizontal. So it's not this universality that I think many people want to boil it down to. Right. It's far more complex. And then if you think of immigrants from like Eastern European countries that come into the United States, they tend to also have, they are categorized as white, but they also tend to also have very collectivistic nature. Yeah. And so it's very much not one or the other. It's I think more reliant upon that worldview.
Yeah.
And then, you know, forgive me, Gus, for saying it or taking a bit of it, but I think it also depends very contextually. When you end up in a new country, you tend to pull together more and sort of, you know, focus very much into like, here's my group and this is the group of people that I need to survive. And then you start connecting within that, because most of us arrive in a receiving community. And so that collectivistic nature of hanging on to one another to be able to be successful in this new environment, I think also begins to happen. And so that familism, I don't think is unique to Latinos either, but I think it is that very much that, you know, here we are in this new situation. What do we have to do to survive and to be successful?
Right.
And so, yeah, I would step away from the whiteness of it. What that kind of says, it's more the worldview that comes with it.
Yeah, and I think Brandy Lynn's comment is also right on that. You know, again, things are not as simple as we would want them to be, because we also have mixed families, and so yeah, again, you know, you have groups that might be at the extremes, but most of the variability is towards the middle, and in some ways that actually speaks to the power of these concepts, because you know, if we're talking about the majority society, which is mixed, which is, you know, not either or, they're not black or white, they're not Latinx or non-Latinx, you would actually probably expect to see even stronger effects if they were at the extremes, at the extreme ends of the spectrum. You know, one of the examples I oftentimes give in class is when I talk about gender differences in aggression, and you know, the strong documented evidence that, you know, in general, boys are more physically aggressive than women and girls, but again, when you actually look at the actual effects of that, they're not that strong, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that there's so much overlap, that there are, of course, a lot of boys and men who are not aggressive, and there are a lot of women and girls who are aggressive. But at the extremes, of course, when we look at our prison systems, for example, well, let's not talk about the prison system. There's other biases there, but you know, but if we think about serious violent offenders and actions and criminal behavior, then we do see more men than women, you know, and at the other end, of course, we see less men and more women. So anyway, so when we're studying culture, any kind of culture variable, such as ethnicity or race or anything like that, we need to keep in mind that we are talking about generalities, and we're not talking, there's always exceptions to the rule, and you know, things are not as straightforward as we would love them to be, you know, because as I said before, human behavior is really difficult.
Oh, but that's what makes it fun.
Yeah, that's what makes it really fun.
Yeah. Cool. Are there any other questions? Aaron, I think we're cool. Do you want to plug in Thursday?
I would love to plug in Thursday. So for those of you who are here live, for those of you who are watching this recording, which should go up in a day, Dr. Carlo is not done. He will be giving another presentation on Thursday, this time for Psych Club, Psych High. He will be doing a From Me to PhD roundtable, in which Dr. Carlo, well, actually, I'm going to give it to Doug. That is Doug's terrain, and I have no right to explain his event. So Doug, explain it for us.
All right, thanks, Aaron. Dr. Carlo has graciously agreed to come speak at our event. which we will discuss kind of his path through his education in academia and how that has kind of relates to his background and you know, where he came from as a person and how it manifested in his career now. So should be pretty cool. Come check us out. The information's in the chat.
You can watch us go at it, since I get to moderate that one.
Oh, yes, this will be moderated by Maria. So
It's gonna be fun.
Why? What did I do to deserve this? I mean, come on.
So 17 years ago, you and
Oh,
Marcella
okay.
and Lisa agreed that I should go to school and get a PhD. And you let me in.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, come on, you know you love me.
Yeah.
And we don't disagree on altruism, we just disagree on this definition. I think it's odd to say that it's selfish when I do it. So I was talking to a student about this. Thank you, everybody. You can stick around or you can go.
Can I sign off real quick, Maria?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. For those of you who are watching the recording, real quick, I do need to slip this in for the purposes of the recording. Dr. Carlo was brought in through the DEI grant that was written and obtained by Dr. I and Dr. B. So Dr. Carlo's Psych Talk was funded by the DEI grant awarded to us by Humboldt State. Thank you again, Dr. Carlo, for your time. For those of you watching the recording, there will be more Psych Talk events occurring throughout the semester, so please be on the lookout for those. Yeah, thank you everyone for your time, and I hope you all have a great day. And for those of you who are watching this recording, I hope you have a great day, an awesome semester, and thank you very much for watching our Psych Talks today. So thank you.
Thank you so much.